Hi, welcome to the Open Skies podcast. In today's episode, we're going to be meeting James Wong, VP with Menzies Asia, and he's going to talk about doing business overseas in the Asian market and specifically in China. Please enjoy this as I enjoyed recording it so much. Thank you very much. I am here with James Wong, Senior Vice President with Menzies.
Correct.
Welcome to the pod, James.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Full disclosure, I've known you for a very long time, and we go back a long time ago from our WestJet days, so it's not like this is the first time I've met you.
Correct.
So let's talk a little bit about your aviation history. So where did it all begin for you?
Where it all began?
Because you've had a fascinating career
I think,
in many different ways.
I think I started when I was 14.
Okay.
When my parents actually forced me into Air Cadets, into the Royal Canadian Air Cadets. So that was the spark. That was the spark for the rest of my life up until now.
And what did that lead to?
What did that lead to? So, through the Air Cadet program, I became a pilot. And that kind of blended into schooling for post-sec into SATE, where I did my avionics. And then from avionics into flight simulation, which is where I joined WestJet and met yourself. And from there into the corporate side of airlines. Further education into some degree programs and whatnot, and moving up the airline world, starting some business on the side, just my entrepreneurial hobbies, and eventually leading to Menzies and my current role now based out of Singapore.
So you're a long way from home, but Calgary is always kind of home base.
Calgary will always be home.
Right. So let's talk about your SimTech days, because that's where we first met.
Yeah.
And that gave you a certain experience. So what was that like?
That was 6 or 7 years of my career, I suppose, at WestJet. And pivotal career growth, anyways. That's where I learned really at the WestJet way, or back in the day when WestJet had good Kool-Aid. And learned a lot about leadership and management, and grew up there really understanding the civilian side of the business and learning about airlines and whatnot. So it was good. Finished off as a lead hand there, but it was fantastic.
Now, and so the SimTech world, but then you transitioned to another part of the company. So that's where we really got to know each other, other than just the sim world, where we actually worked directly together. And in fact, you were my boss at one point. So
right.
Let's talk about the ops performance team, the legendary ops
operational
performance.
That was an interesting team, actually. I really enjoyed it. Allowed me to flex some new skills as it related to business analytics and operational analytics. Right, so really giving a bird's eye view of an entire company, both from an operational standpoint and from a corporate admin side of things.
Right.
So that was a really good experience, and really seeing how all the puzzle pieces fit together that actually ran an airline and how it related to efficiencies and operations. So extremely useful in that span.
Did you feel back then, because I have my opinions, but do you feel like we had the data that needed to make the decisions we were making, or do you think there was a gap?
I think the world was young, so it wasn't just WestJet or the IT investments that were involved and whatnot. But big data was still relatively young at a global level.
Right.
And unless you were the Amazons or the Microsofts or the Googles that specialized in IT, all this other industry is falling behind. And a lot of companies like WestJet would, as a personal opinion, would underinvest in that part of the world, right, and try to fill those gaps with people. And I think in this day and age, if you were to compare the technologies and the cost of technology today compared to what it was, when we were there 10 years ago, there'd be a big difference, right? So
right, especially with the elasticity of some of the cloud-based computing that goes
absolutely,
on, where you kind of pay as you go, and it's cheaper on the lower end, and elastic. Do you see the same gaps now? Or do you see airlines making the same mistakes, or maybe not evolving quickly, or do you see some airlines well ahead of the curve?
I think the gap still exists, but it's different.
Okay.
The concept of big data and data lakes haven't been around for that long.
Right.
They've come in tranches in terms of 5 or 10 years. And even with the onset of AI now everyone's trying to scramble and adapt to even a newer technology. Whereas they may not have even established the infrastructure for the older technology.
Right.
So we're constantly learning and trying to take advantage of new technologies, and companies are trying to constantly stay at the forefront of what they can afford.
Right.
Right. So because of that, it creates gaps all the way through. So while they're still learning and still trying to build a foundation, they're also trying to drive forward. Right.
Right.
So I think that even the advent of AI, everybody wants to take advantage of it.
Right.
Nobody really knows how.
It's kind of the buzzword right now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And it's in some companies it's just a chatbot working really well, and in other companies it's major decision making. So.
Absolutely. And then it's so department driven as well, right? So although a
100%.
company might have a really grand IT map and dream, really it's department driven by the individual managers, and sometimes
Right.
they just go all over the place.
So after that, you had two kind of forks in the road. You left your WestJet career, and where did you go from there?
Yeah, I went to a company called ClearGrid.
Right.
And ClearGrid is based out of Springbank here in Calgary with a really good friend of mine, and she continues to operate the business. And basically, it's an aerial data collection company, flying small aircraft around all of Canada.
So I think you're underselling it a bit, because I think ClearGrid is a very cool. This is not a paid advertisement for ClearGrid, but meter readers used to go house to house to house to house to check if it was accurate. Correct?
Yeah, we introduced some amazing tech.
Yeah.
So most meters, electricity or water meters and whatnot, back in the day, it used to be a person that walked up to your house and would collect the data physically and visually by looking at the meter. A few decades later, it turned into wireless, so people would drive around with trucks. And even to this day, that seems to be the more predominant way of collecting meter readings. They drive around with a truck, and it's wireless. And what we've
Just
done,
hitting each.
yeah, exactly. They'll drive down the street and they'll just collect everything wireless off the signal. And what we've done is really developed a technology in that company to have even greater sensitivity and fidelity, and we can capture the same signal except from a few thousand feet away. So far enough that it's about 5,000, 6,000 feet, and so we threw the technology into an aircraft instead. And because of that, the sweep is significantly greater. So what would normally take 100 drivers in 30 days in a cycle to capture all of Calgary, we can do in 2 days in one aircraft.
That's crazy.
Yeah, so we save a ton of carbon footprint, a ton of labor, a ton of costs for the utility companies. We're able to sell that data back to the billing cycles.
Now, how many cities is ClearGrid operating in now?
In Canada?
Yeah.
Right now we cover all of Alberta, both rural and urban, which is fantastic, and then expanding into Ontario, as well as some work south of the border in the U.S. as well.
Wow. Okay. Are there many competitors in the space, or are you really the primary disruptor?
We are the sole service provider, is how I like to put it.
Sole service provider. That's a good place to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Okay, so that was one fork in the road. What was the second fork? Because you went from ClearGrid and then you ended up where?
Yeah, that's when I ended up at Menzies.
Right.
So in ClearGrid, I took care of flight ops and the operations that ran that business. And then Menzies asked me to go out to Vancouver and help them out with the business out there for air cargo.
And that was a smaller operation at the time.
Smaller operations, only about 130, 150 employees given at the time. It was 2018, I think it was. And basically, we were just running a few, budgetary problems and some cultural issues. So just looking for a manager to kind of flip that business around, move it back into success, drive some operational efficiencies, and move on from there.
And you probably expected to spend a long time in Vancouver.
Yeah, I had planned on living there for quite some time. I was only there for 6 months.
6 months.
6 months. It was an interesting adventure in those 6 months, though.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So what did you learn from your 6 months in Vancouver? What was the
You
the
know,
big
I
takeaways?
think Menzies was the first true multinational corporation I've ever worked for.
Really?
And so that was a lot of exposure in understanding how a real MNC operates from a business perspective, and how it integrates on a global level and with a company that's spread right around the world. So that was really, really neat, as well as exposure to multiple international airlines and the different operating procedures and SOPs that they had. And that was something very unfamiliar for me because I was so focused on WestJet, and that
you
really
grow up
was
in your world.
Yeah, exactly. And to see the diversity and the different ways that people do things was quite an eye opener.
Right.
And that was extremely helpful and really helped broaden my base, as well as to meet a ton of people from the global industry. So that helped a lot in that experience.
Right.
Yeah.
And then from Vancouver, you ended up moving to
Toronto.
Yes.
So we moved from the GM of Vancouver over to a sales position, commercial, into Toronto to run Menzies Canada, and that was right before COVID. So that was a really good experience as well.
Right.
So that kind of started moving my career more onto the corporate and now onto the commercial side. So kind of taking care of the operations, looked at HR when it came to organizational development and redesign for org structures,
Right.
and then now moving into the commercial world.
Right.
And that was really, really neat. Really understanding how the revenue side of the business plays with the cost side of the business and how to integrate that. And that was a really good learning experience as well.
And then COVID.
Yeah, COVID
right?
was
Which
fantastic.
is pretty much everybody's story when it comes to like, we had recorded an earlier podcast where COVID was came up as well. How did that affect Menzies in Toronto for you personally? And I know 90% of the industry was relatively shut down at that point, but how did that affect you? How did it affect your role?
COVID was a sad time. Most people would say challenging, but on a personal level, it was extremely sad. We probably reduced our labor workforce close to 80-85% in that span of 6 months. And to have that personal touch point with laying off people and giving them bad news was, on a personal level, very, very tough.
Yeah.
But it was also great motivation to drive the business forward in terms of growth.
To get those jobs back.
Yeah, and we were really lucky in some ways. I mean, our head office in Toronto went from about 50 employees down to 6.
Wow.
And the 6 of us managed to grow the business geographically during COVID. And we were able to grow, we really tripled the footprint across Canada, from 4 stations to 12 and then later on to 16. And so although we weren't able to retain jobs in existing stations because we had to reduce the size, we were able to establish new opportunities in new places.
Right.
So at least it was kind of on paper it looked great because we were growing. On a personal level, it was still tough because it was still impacting individuals, right? So that was it was a really interesting way to play the game. When we called it a day, I really reflected on what we were doing. We were using the excuse of, hey, like the company's still alive, we're still thriving, we're still growing. But it was definitely tough on us on a personal level, right? Talking to individual people.
So when you went down to 6 people, part of that had to do with the border closure and nobody being able to come over and help and help support you guys. So how did that go? Did you feel like you were on your own island, or?
A lot of people say that really we are a small business. Menzies is a small business.
Yeah.
We're 50,000 people across the globe, but the reality is that the people that actually run the business is very, very small.
Right.
Head offices might only be anywhere between 10 to 20 people, even though there's thousands of frontliners that are actually doing the work. And a lot of that was really emphasized during COVID. We were down to a team of 6. We still had thousands of employees that were still with us, that were still retained, right? And between 6 of us in a small business, like any small business, you tend to do whatever needs to be done.
Right.
So even though a person might be specialized in HR or one specialized in ops,
roll up the sleeves.
Yeah, exactly. If a room needed to be painted, then you would paint the room, right? Whatever it took, throwing bags on the front line when we had to, driving the accounts and doing AP and AR when we had to, whatever it took. And so it was actually, in some ways, a blessing in disguise because you got to touch every single part of the business,
right?
As a result of that.
So, and one of the big trends during that whole COVID time was the outsourcing of jobs by airlines. Mm-hmm. So airlines would stop using their own employees. How did that affect Menzies?
I mean, that's a good news story for the ground handling industry. What's interesting about it, though, is that when these airlines decide to change their strategy across and outsource the work, they would change the way that they did business operationally.
Yeah.
And that's something that a lot of airlines are not willing to give up in some ways.
Yeah.
But further to that, too, in their strategies for outsourcing is that they would divide out decision-making capability. So they'd have their ops teams driving efficiencies, driving the SOPs, and then they would separate the financial side with a separate team, usually, bundled with procurement. And those teams don't talk, and they never have.
No.
And they all operate on different KPIs, right? One wants to get the best deal, and one wants to give the best service, and everything comes at a cost, right? And so for ground handlers in our field, usually we tout ourselves as being, experts in the industry, experts in those specific processes to turn aircraft.
Right.
And so the tighter the cuffs that a customer puts on us, the harder it is to do our job, the higher the cost rate.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it is cross-communicating, educating the carriers in terms of what do they actually want,
right?
And what are they willing to pay for. So that's an interesting dynamic that a lot of these airlines didn't have, right? Because they had a lot of control over their main hubs, which is their primary point of contact with their passengers. But yet in the smaller hubs or even the small airports that they fly to, it's not as important to them.
Right.
And so having them lose some of that control is very nerve-wracking for them, right? So.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think that process is finished now? I know you're not in Canada anymore, but do you think that's still in flux, or do you think that it's kind of settled now?
I'm not really sure about the Canadian landscape, but I know that
This wasn't just a Canadian phenomenon. This happened
correct happened in
everywhere
Australia,
across-
happened in the
across
U.S.,
the globe.
and even now with a lot of the startup airlines that are happening in the Southeast Asia and China region, they're starting to recognize that at the get-go, at the start.
Right.
And a lot of it is saying, what is it that you actually want to accomplish with your passengers? You know, how do you want to measure what you consider to be success? Whether that's an NPS score, or D0 timing, or whatever the case may be.
Surviving.
Correct.
To provide the service.
Yeah, or if having a margin to hit, right?
Yeah.
What is that measurement, and how much do they actually want to get involved with the process?
Right.
All right, and how much do they want to trust with us? So I think they're a lot more open nowadays than they were back in the day.
Right.
And even Qantas, if you look at them, like they're trying to potentially bring it all back in. And they were actually the first ones to set the bar, and send everything outwards, right? So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next year or two, whether it's
cyclical.
worth doing. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so now you're starting to talk about the Asian marketplace. How did you end up Toronto to Singapore?
You know what? Southeast Asia is one of the largest growing economies,
Right.
especially even in terms of the rate of growth. CAGRs over the last 5 years has been upwards of 8 to 10%, which is massive. And then when we look
Right.
at China, they're talking about a pullback in terms of economic growth, showing figures of 4 to 6%. There are massive regions in the world that would die to have a 4 to 6% growth
Yeah.
rate.
Yeah, of
just
course.
because they came down from 20s. Go figure. And so Menzies was extremely underrepresented in that part of the world. And so there was a large opportunity to be had, and not in a focus for our company at the time. So
Yeah.
it was a good opportunity to head out there and kind of start leading the growth and the presence of Menzies in Southeast Asia.
So what's that like now?
What's that
So
like now?
You took the big risk, moved out there.
Yeah.
And now, how's it going?
It's
what's the
going
market
well.
like?
It's it's still a big market, and we're still very small.
Yeah.
When I got out there and we established this new region for Menzies, we only had 2 operations. One in Macau and one in Jakarta, and that was it. And a really small employee count. Just about 1,100 employees. And that was 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago now. And now we're currently sitting at about, I'd say 4 to 5 operations. One of them's kind of quasi, and upwards of 4,000 employees.
Excellent.
Triple the P&L that we had 2 years ago. So it's so far it's a good success story, but it's a very different way of doing business out there, as it is compared to North America or even Europe.
So give me a little bit about that. What's the differences?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been studying this for some of my schooling that I'm still doing, and I'm really into business development now. So it's all about mergers and acquisitions and greenfield growth. And it takes a lot more patience to do business out there compared to the more Western corporate style of doing business over here.
Right.
Everything here is actually a lot more numbers driven and very factual in a lot of ways. So it's actually quite easy to counter argue and negotiate and whatnot.
Yeah, numbers are numbers.
Yeah, numbers are numbers.
Yeah.
And I find that in Eastern corporate culture, there's a lot about relationships and a lot about networking. And sometimes it takes years to build on those relationships.
Right.
And that's really the key. And I think some of it exists in Western corporate culture, but it's not as forefront. Here you can sit down with the procurement team that you've never met before and hash out a deal in 3-4 months.
Right.
But over there, you hash out deals over years.
Right.
And really the payback is on the back end. It takes a long time for it to realize. So the question is whether or not companies are willing to invest for that length of time and not see any results just yet.
Yeah.
And it's difficult when you're dealing with public companies, because they have the quarterly reports they have to do. They have their annual reports that they have to do, right? So they need to show something to the shareholders to prove that investments are going to pay off and get an ROI, but you don't really get that when you're investing in relationships.
Right. So it's not speed dating; it's long-term relationships.
Correct. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
What's Menzies' market share right now in Southeast Asia?
Oh, we're small. The largest player right now in Southeast Asia is SATS, who recently acquired WFS. I'd probably say we're tiny.
Yeah,
Tiny. Even from a percentage standpoint, I'd say we're less than 5% of the market.
So this gives you an incredible opportunity to start stealing some market share.
Or growing new ones, yes.
Growing new ones.
Yeah.
Okay, where's the opportunities? Where's the growth?
You know what? China is always going to be the massive driver.
Yeah.
Swissport tried it decades ago, and they ended up in a reverse buyout, and they failed. And I think that was kind of, going back to this whole concept of the Eastern corporate versus Western corporate style, that's kind of what happened.
Right.
And I think this time around, there's a strong possibility that we can, kind of bridge that gap.
Yeah.
And try to explore and grow into China. We just recently established operations again in Hong Kong, which is a massive airport for us at a global level.
Right.
And using that leverage and the momentum that we have from our reputation now to kind of drive even further inland into China. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there. The government's shifting. It's a little bit more stable if you think of it independently from North America. And they're really starting to deregulate and modernize their aviation systems out there, right? So it's good.
Yeah, there's so much growth happening in China when it comes to aviation.
Absolutely.
There's new airlines popping up everywhere, and
there's new aircraft.
The Comac. We're on a few of those planes.
Yep.
It's just an amazing growth sector. What's it like doing business in China versus the rest? Is there a difference with China versus the rest of Southeast Asia, or? And I'm not talking like Australia, New Zealand, that kind of like the...
Probably like the Malaysias, the Thailands, the Singapores. Yeah, it's... they're still very traditional in a lot of ways.
Right.
And, where the rest of the world is trying to get away from business cards, for example, just as a sign of sustainability. In China, that ritual of exchanging business cards with a bow and a handshake will always be there.
Right.
Similarly, when we sit in boardroom meetings, they're very formal. And whatnot. And I think that's going to carry on at least for the next few more decades.
Right.
That culture, those rituals will continue to always exist.
Right.
Whereas the Southeast Asian or the Asian tends to be a lot more adaptive and more westernized than China ever will be, right? So just recognizing the cultural differences and being sensitive, to every single country that you go into is extremely important.
So it sounds like there's a lot of pre-work that goes into that.
Absolutely. Tons of cultural study.
Right, trying to figure out exactly how to connect and
correct.
Right.
Yeah, even something as simple as trying to present a thank you gift, is very sensitive, both in terms of sitting on the fence between bribery and corruption, and are saying that this is actually like a
genuine
gift.
appreciation.
Yeah, it's a genuine appreciation, business to business kind of thing, versus I don't know what a good comparison is. It's kind of like birthdays in a lot of ways between Eastern and Western cultures. In the Western culture, when you get a birthday gift, it's important that you act really excited and you open it right away and you play with it and you appreciate it right away.
Right.
In the Eastern side of the world, when you receive that gift, you often put it off to the side. And that delay of gratification is just a sign of respect to the person that's actually giving it.
And somebody from a Western culture could be like,
insulted.
Not like the gift?
Exactly. Yeah, so it's really understanding those little nuances, and they feed right into business and negotiations and whatnot.
Have you found that a challenge growing up here in Canada, transitioning to that market, to understand those differences and to, be respectful of the cultural differences?
Yeah, I think I'm pretty lucky because I'm a first generation Canadian.
Right.
So I still had a lot of my experiences on both sides of the cultural barrier. So it was really, really good. It helped a lot that I'm Western educated, but I'm able to appreciate some of those cultural sensitivities. It's not to say I'm an expert. When I got there, it was still a culture shock for me, and I'm still learning day by day, week by week when I'm going to those countries and interacting with those people. So yeah.
So $1 million question then: what are airlines not doing that they should be doing now? Based on your experience, you've seen both sides of it. You've seen the operating of an airline. You've seen being a partner of the airline, right? Where's that sweet spot between outsourcing, keeping things in-house, deferring to the experts versus becoming an expert yourself when it comes to ground ops and that kind of stuff? Like, what is the trends that you're seeing that you think airlines can improve upon?
That's an interesting question because I guess it's really specific to what sector of an airline. Whether you're talking about passenger airlines, talking about cargo airlines, you're talking about guys that just specialize in ACMI charters.
Right.
And there's room for all of them. And there's room for a lot of different business models.
Right.
And ultimately, it really depends on where they want to put themselves in that model, right? Are they a low-cost carrier? Are they a true ULCC? Right? Are they somewhere in the middle? Yeah, are they hybrid? Are they full-service carrier? And really being able to identify where they are and having deep enough pockets to drive that business until it become profitable.
Right.
In the last 2 years, I've seen multiple airlines spark up and fail, within a span of a year. And again, I've also seen some airlines that have sparked up and have been able to just barely sustain. They're now operationally break even. In the grand scheme of things, they're still losing money.
Right.
And I think a lot of them lack identity. And there's not enough airline expertise driving the growth of a lot of these carriers. A lot of them are startups from people that still think of aviation as being very, very sexy. You know,
Right.
I get to buy an airplane. Oh, I own an airline. It's fantastic.
And it is until you have to
Yeah,
pay
it's only
the
going to
bill.
cost me $10 million, and then all of a sudden they're in for $100 million, and they don't realize, you know, like, oh, I'm still losing money. Like, it doesn't
Right.
make sense. You know, and they hire the wrong people in place. The expertise in the field is still very, very small.
Right.
And I think that the ability to adapt cross-border and globally is great, but the reality is that every region, every country is still unique.
Yeah.
You know, and we even see that in Canada when you start importing talent from either south of the border or across the pond to try to run carriers here. It's that they all have successes in their homes where they grew up, you know, very familiar with the market, with the economics, and then trying to apply the same, you know, cookie stamp into a different part of the world is very, very tough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, you hit the nail on the head too when you're talking about Canada as a very unique environment, right? People think you could take the ULCC model and go, well, Canada is one of the only developed countries that doesn't have one,
Right.
like a real successful one. And I'm not discounting Flair, but I mean, to be continued there, right? They're not at that stage of 50, 60 aircraft yet. And you know, you have these ideas that come in and think, you know, hey, we're gonna revolutionize this space, and then you realize how far apart Canada is, how high the taxation is, how the airport rent situation is different from other operating environments, and then they're just not successful. You know, this is a question just off the top of my head, do you feel ULCC in Canada could be successful based on your experience?
You know what? I'm not an expert in the airlines. If I was to start one here, I probably wouldn't start a ULCC.
Right.
But there's no demand in Canada for flying relative to other countries and other places.
Okay.
You know, when you look at you know, now that I'm more familiar with Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore and Thailand and stuff like that, the sheer density of the population.
Yeah.
By consequence, there's a demand for aviation.
Yeah, you don't see Dreamliners on commuter routes here.
Yeah, exactly. You know, those guys are flying A380s for hour-and-a-half legs.
Right.
Right, and they're full.
And they're full.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough to get economy of scale. That's crazy. Okay. With that being said, where do you think, besides China, is the next growth sector in Southeast Asia? Like, do you see more ULCs coming up, or do you see, like, what's the trend?
Cargo carriers are the way to go.
Still, because that was the
Absolutely,
big buzz
absolutely.
after COVID. Everybody wanted to start a cargo airline. Is that still on fire down there?
You know what? It still is. It's that the commodities have changed.
Yeah.
You know, the advent of e-commerce shopping and whatnot that started or really took hold during COVID continues to take hold now.
Right.
You know, companies like Temu and TikTok and Taobao and Amazon, those guys are continue to drive demand.
Yeah.
The difference is that cargo warehouses were never designed for e-commerce. You know, they were designed for big dry goods. They're designed for fruits
Pallets.
and vegetables. Yeah, exactly. They're designed for pallets, not small envelopes by the thousands. And that's kind of where the demand is now. Everybody wants their goods, you know, within the hour or same day.
Right.
And when we look at Southeast Asia, everything's an island. Everything from the Philippines to Indonesia to Malaysia, everything is islands.
Yeah, so you're not driving it in a truck.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then just north of that is China, where 90% of these goods are being produced and continue to be produced regardless.
Right.
So there's a huge demand for narrow body cargo, as much as there is for international cargo on wide bodies. I mean, just recently, Air France KLM or Martin Air, the cargo subsidiary, just shifted cargo capacity from South America down over to Southeast Asia and China.
Wow.
And a massive movement of their wide body fleet across the board because they need more space. They need more meet the demand, essentially, right? So
Wow.
it's quite significant.
I never even thought about how island-specific Southeast Asia must be for cargo. That does lend itself very well to air travel.
Yeah, absolutely. If you even look at like just Indonesia, it's actually wider than Canada is in terms of east to west, in terms of their geography. And there's over 200 islands, right? And so everything is driven by air.
Right.
Absolutely everything.
Well, it sounds like you still have a lot of work to do in Southeast
Yup.
Asia.
I'll be there for a while.
That's good. Well, we're about done for time today, but what I would like to ask everybody is, I love to travel. You've seen the world. Where do I need to go next?
Where do you need to go next?
Besides Singapore to see you.
You know what? Singapore is a great place to base yourself out of. Look at it that way.
Okay.
You know, it's very similar to Europe. Once you're there, traveling is like very, very cheap, right? So definitely come to Singapore, base yourself out of there, spend a couple of weeks. Yep. You know, Bali's a quick 45-minute flight away. Bangkok's a quick hour flight away. The Philippines are fantastic if you want to go to Cebu or Manila to actually check out the beaches and the big cities and whatnot. China is an amazing country to actually see with your own eyes and really get your own objective viewpoint of it. They're decades ahead of us, decades ahead of North America, really, when it comes to technology and economic growth. And Hong Kong has come back full bore, from what it was 10 years ago. It's a great city to be in now. So.
Well, I'm going to have to take you up on that Singapore offer, and thank you so much for coming into the office on your vacation, no less, so I do appreciate that. And thank you for spending some time with us today. We're going to be back with some great new episodes coming up soon. Thank you so much.